Every year, tons of cadmium, a highly toxic heavy metal, are released into the environment. It's in the batteries we throw away, the soil where our food grows, and even in the water we drink. But how does it get there, and why should you care? In today's video, we're diving into the world of cadmium. We'll explore its sources, how it impacts the environment and our health, and what can be done to address this silent threat. Stick around to find out how even small actions can make a big difference. This is an issue that affects everyone, but many of us have never even heard of it. If you care about the planet, or just want to know what's in your backyard, make sure to watch until the end. And don't forget to subscribe for more environmental insights. So, what exactly is cadmium? It's a naturally occurring element, represented by the symbol Cd on the periodic table. Cadmium is soft, bluish-white, and mostly used in industrial processes. You'll find it in things like batteries, pigments, and coatings. But here's the problem: cadmium is highly toxic, even in small amounts. Once it gets into the environment, it doesn't just disappear, it lingers, contaminating soil, water, and even the food we eat. To put it in perspective, think of cadmium like glitter at a party. It seems small and manageable, but once it's spilled, it's almost impossible to clean up, and it gets everywhere. Now that we know what cadmium is, let's talk about where it comes from and why it's showing up in places it shouldn't. Cadmium doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It comes from a mix of natural processes and human activities, and unfortunately, we're responsible for a big part of the problem. Let's start with the human-made sources, which are the biggest contributors to cadmium pollution. Cadmium is released during mining and smelting, especially when refining metals like zinc, lead, or copper. Factories that manufacture batteries, pigments, and plastics also emit cadmium into the air and water. Here's something surprising: cadmium is present in some fertilizers. When these fertilizers are used on crops, cadmium can accumulate in the soil and eventually in our food. Batteries and electronics contain cadmium. If they're not recycled properly, this toxic metal can leach into the soil and groundwater. But it's not all our fault. Cadmium also occurs naturally. Volcanic eruptions and erosion of rocks release small amounts of cadmium into the environment. However, these sources are minimal compared to what humans are adding. Once cadmium is in the environment, it moves quickly. It can travel through air, settle in water and soil, and eventually end up in plants, animals, and even on your dinner plate. So now we know where cadmium comes from. But what happens once it's in the environment? Let's look at the damage it can cause to ecosystems and our health. Cadmium doesn't just sit harmlessly in the environment, it spreads, accumulates, and creates problems for ecosystems, animals, and humans. Let's break down its impact. When cadmium accumulates in soil, it reduces fertility, making it harder for plants to grow. And even when plants do grow, they can absorb cadmium, which contaminates the food we eat. Cadmium in water can devastate aquatic ecosystems. Fish and other organisms can absorb cadmium, which not only harms them but also impacts the predators that rely on them for food. Now, let's talk about how cadmium affects us. Long-term exposure to cadmium, even in small amounts, can lead to severe kidney damage. The kidneys struggle to filter out cadmium, causing them to lose function over time. Cadmium can interfere with calcium absorption, weakening bones and increasing the risk of fractures. This is particularly concerning in older adults. Cadmium is classified as a human carcinogen, meaning prolonged exposure can increase the risk of cancer, especially lung and prostate cancers. One of cadmium's most dangerous traits is bioaccumulation. This means it builds up in plants and animals over time. So, if you eat food grown in cadmium-contaminated soil, it could end up in your body, too. It's clear that cadmium pollution is a serious threat, but what can we do about it? Let's explore the solutions and actions being taken around the world. Now that we understand how cadmium enters the environment and the harm it causes, the big question is, what can we do about it? Fortunately, there are ways to reduce cadmium pollution, protect ecosystems, and minimize human exposure. Solutions come from both government regulations and individual actions. One of the most effective ways to reduce cadmium pollution is through government policies and industry regulations. Many countries have already taken steps to limit cadmium emissions, but there is still more work to be done. Some countries have restricted cadmium use in batteries, plastics, and pigments. The EU, for example, has banned cadmium in certain products to prevent pollution. Factories involved in mining, smelting, and battery production must follow strict environmental guidelines to control cadmium emissions. Proper waste treatment and air filtration systems can prevent cadmium from entering water and air. Many countries now require proper disposal and recycling of cadmium-containing products, especially electronics and batteries. Agriculture is a major source of cadmium contamination, but farmers can take steps to reduce cadmium buildup in soil and crops. Some phosphate fertilizers contain cadmium, so using low-cadmium alternatives can prevent soil contamination. Certain plants absorb less cadmium than others. Rotating crops and improving soil pH can help reduce cadmium uptake by plants. Regular soil testing allows farmers to monitor cadmium levels and take corrective actions if needed. A major source of cadmium pollution is e-waste, batteries, old electronics, and industrial waste. When these items are not disposed of correctly, cadmium can leak into the environment. Many countries have battery recycling programs to prevent toxic metals from entering landfills. Individuals can help by properly recycling old devices instead of throwing them away. Some waste requires special handling to prevent cadmium leaching. Governments and industries must ensure that hazardous waste is treated correctly. While government actions are essential, individuals can also protect themselves from cadmium exposure in everyday life. Some foods, such as rice, leafy greens, and shellfish, can contain higher cadmium levels if grown in contaminated areas. Washing produce and choosing food from trusted sources can help reduce risk. Cigarettes contain cadmium, and smoking is one of the largest sources of human exposure. Avoiding tobacco products significantly lowers cadmium intake. Check for regulations on items like jewelry, plastics, and pigments that may contain cadmium, and choose safer alternatives when possible. Cadmium pollution is a serious issue, but it's not unsolvable. With stronger regulations, better farming and waste management practices, and more awareness, we can reduce cadmium exposure and protect both human health and the environment.